There we go. Cool. So is everything, can you hear me on the Zoom now? Thumbs up. Great. Cool. So what I was saying is that today we're going to continue learning about the next steps in creating a rig, and that will include creating control joints versus deforming joints, and controls that are splines, which are these curves. In general, when you're animating, these are the things that will have keyframes on it. So if I were to move this around, this is the root control for the character. So that has keyframes on it. You can see down here, and that ends up adding it to some kind of animation. The other thing that I'll mention is now that we're branching into control joints and controls and all these extra things in your scene, organization over here is going to become more and more important. Because in the end, if this wasn't an organized character, if I just select Nikki, it's everything. This is actually made of all the joints, all the geometry, and then the control rig, which is made of controls, which is also made of controlled joints. And each of these have their own thing. So it just keeps going and going and going as you're building the complexity of the rig. So if you don't have a good organization or things inside of these little groups, which is a big part of using groups, is kind of making it like a folder system almost. Then in the end, if you look at your hierarchy, it's going to be terrifying and it's not going to be easy to see what's going on. So that being said, let's jump into our trusty Ernie file and get going. Okay, so where we left off, I would say that the paint weights currently on Ernie are good enough. They're not perfect, but I went ahead and blocked out some stuff so that the elbow doesn't have any kind of runoff, and also in the fingers, I believe that they're blocked out too. Yeah, so it's not pulling on other fingers, so we can start to get going. All right, so what do I mean by control joint or deformer joint? So what we've been working with so far, I would describe as being a deformer joint because it's attached to a skin and it deforms the skin. So like I mentioned a while ago, there are a couple ways that you can control these limbs. One way is using forward kinematics, and forward kinematics usually is just rotating, and that's how you would think about it. You would, rotate this joint and it moves everything below it, and you rotate this joint and it moves everything below that, but doesn't move anything above it. This is very much just how a skeleton behaves. Forward kinematics is how a skeleton behaves. And if you were to move this root, then it will move everything. So inverse kinematics, alternatively, move this out of the way, is something that behaves a little bit differently. So this is a inverse kinematic handle. And if I were to grab it and move it, you can see now if I am grabbing the ankle, it's moving the knee and the hip together. Why this is good is because if I were to move, oh, I guess it's not really set up yet to do it. Eventually what it will happen is if you were to move this waist, like you saw, I guess maybe on the intro character, the feet would stay put. So it's like keeps them planted. So you can simulate being in contact with things. That's what it's very useful for. So walking in the inverse kinematic is much easier to do walk cycles with, or if you're touching a door or looking like you're pushing up and like moving off of an object, keeping the hands in place is much easier with inverse kinematics. But we don't want to put all of that fanciness on the joints themselves. We want to create duplicates of these joint chains, rig them up with this fancy stuff, and then use constraints which is the big thing we're going to focus on today, to get our deformer joints to either follow them or not follow them. So what is a constraint? A constraint is up here inside of the rigging tab. You have a couple different options. The one that we're going to focus heavily on today is parent constraint. And so what does a parent constraint do? It basically makes the whatever object that you're constrained to the other one both follow along in position and rotate along with whatever it's constrained to. So right now, you can see that if I were to rotate the head, get out of here, his hair is staying behind. Not optimal, right? So what we can do, I guess, to this point, one way we could make it work would be to select the hair first, select the joint second, and hit P. And that would directly parent it. So if I were to look at where the hair is in the hierarchy, it's no longer inside of my geometry. It's been moved out of here. Where it's been put is underneath of my head joint. So if I move my head joint, now the hair follows along. So that's one method of getting things to follow. But what we're going to do is a little bit more, it's better suited to organization and rigging, because you can keep all of your meshes together without plopping them into your joints and like polluting the joint chain and making it hard to see where things are. What you can do is it's the opposite selection order with a constraint. So whatever you select last is the thing that's going to be constrained, versus parenting, it was the thing that you selected first, right? So if I wanted to get the parent or the hair to follow this head joint, I would select the head joint first, then holding shift, I can click on the hair second, come up to constrain. I'll bring up the options just for this first one. So the main checkbox that you'll either toggle on or toggle off is this one called maintain offset. And if it's on, that means that the object will just stay put and it will rotate or move relative to its current position. If you uncheck it, it'll snap objects like right on top of whatever you're constraining it to. So I'll demonstrate what that means here in a second. So I'm going to leave maintain offset turned on just because I want the hair to stay put. And I'll hit apply. So now if I were to rotate, the hair follows along, and if you look over here, it's still in the same place, but it has this little constraint as a child. So you can see that there's something going on with this hair, and that's why the hair is following along. So the eyes, you can do the same thing. So I'll select head joint first, then this eye second, constrain it, and constrain it. So now, if I move this head joint, everything follows along nicely because it's constrained. Head joint first, and then whatever you want to follow second.
You want to do each one individually?
Yes, constraints, you can only kind of do one at a time unless you're using code. So, yeah.
We can constrain multiple objects on one joint.
Yes, so all that, like the head and the eyes are all constrained to the same thing. Cool. So what does this mean? Oh yeah, I was going to demonstrate. So the other thing that you can use constraints for is to line things up sometimes. This is like a little bit of a trick. So if I had this sphere, and for whatever reason, I wanted to put this sphere exactly where this joint is. What I could do is select like the shoulder joint first, select this thing second, and then in the constraint options, I can turn off maintain offset, and it will pop it right in place, which is nice instead of having to like carefully reposition stuff. Once it's in place, you can actually come in and delete the constraint, and then it's just back to being a normal sphere. So it's a quick way of snapping things in place as well, but just thought I'd mention it in case. All right. So parent constraints, very powerful. And what I was saying about duplicate joint chains, this is what I'd recommend for setting up our first limb. We're going to get our leg set up with both an IK chain and an FK chain, and then constrain our deformer joints to both of those. And then what you can do is turn off and on the influence of those different constraints so that it will follow one versus the other based on something else. So I know that's a lot. Hopefully it'll make sense in about 15, 20 minutes. Cool. So first step in getting a joint chain set up is you can just select the top joint in whatever you want. And in this case, it's my leg. I'll hit Control D and then Shift P. And so that'll pop it out of the joint chain. I duplicated it and then I unparented it. So now if I were to hide my deformer joints, I still have this duplicate joint chain, which I'm immediately going to change some names in here so I can keep track of it easier. Up here in modify, you have this thing called search and replace names. And I believe we've maybe mentioned it before, but for this part of the process, search and replace is really, really useful. Right now, everything ends in underscore joint, but I want to make sure that I can tell that this is not deformer joints, this is FK joints. So I'll search for underscore JNT and replace with underscore FK JNT. And if I click apply, so it added that to everything. So now I can get rid of that number one. So now this joint chain is hip FK joint, knee FK joint, ankle FK joint. We're good to go. This is looking promising. So if we come in here to our original joint chain, we've got hip joint, hip FK joint. And I usually use the outliner to set up the rest of the constraints, just because clicking on top of joints that are right in the same place is a little bit tricky because you don't know necessarily which one you're selected on. This guarantees that you're selecting the right thing at the right time. So like I said, the thing that you want to follow is the thing that you select second. So first, I would select my FK hip joint. I can hold Command in, because this is Mac. If you're on a Windows, you would hold Control and click the hip joint second, because I want my deformer joints to follow my FK joint. Then up here in constrain, parent, I will leave maintain offset turned off because it's a duplicate of the joint, so it should be exactly the same and in exactly the right place. I'll hit apply. So now you can see that this hip joint has a parent constraint on it. And if I were to select my FK joint, my deformer joint is following along. You basically just repeat this process for the knee, ankle, foot, and foot end. So now each of these control joints should move my deformer joints. Yep. Yep. New one and then the old one. For the control joint, then the deformer joint. Okay. All right. So like I said, you don't want to animate on the joints themselves. You want to animate on controls. So now in this next step, we're going to make a couple controls. And this is, I would say, just a nice straightforward way of generating a spline control. So underneath of your curves and surfaces, you've got a couple defaults. I use circle all the time. And click it, and just put a little spline circle right in the middle of the world. You could scale it like this, and then hit modify freeze transformations so that you're starting out with the control at 0, 0, 0 world, 0, 0, 0 rotate, and 1, 1, 1 scale. That's great. This I'm going to make as my hip control. So the first thing I'll do is rename it our hip FK. But my naming convention that I like to use is CTRL in the end if it's a control, so I can quickly select things in the future. If you want to use a different thing like CT or something like that, I would just highly recommend ending your controls with a common thing. So if you want to use that, that's great. Oh, a couple chat messages. All right, please, if you're zooming, I miss chat, go ahead and speak up. Okay, the deformer is the child. Yes, the deformer is the child. Is there a faster way to pair constraints, or do you have to go one by one? There is a faster way, but it involves coding and scripting, and we can get into that, I think, next class is my plan. But for now, doing it manually is the fastest way. Cool. So next step is an important one. So if I were to move this control into place, it's adding these new little values up here. What that's going to do is limit what you can do with your control and adding in extra things in the future, which you don't know what they are yet, but set-driven keys, it's a really powerful tool. You're not going to be able to do that either. So the first thing that I do whenever I have a brand new control is just group it 2 times. The hotkey for grouping is Control G. So if I select my control and hit Control G 2 times, now you can see over here, I've got my control and it's inside of both of these groups. Why you want to do that is you use these groups for different purposes. This first one, oops, I always forget, it's Mac. Yeah. All right, so this group I called the Z group. And this group I just called group. So what do you use each one of these for? So I use the group to put the control where it needs to go. So if I select this and then hold this for a second, select my group, hold V, see how my thing changes? Now I can snap it right on top of my joint. And it offset it. So now these values are in the translates, but my control has stayed nice and cool. It's nice and zeroed out. There's no translates, there's no rotates, and it's because it's inside of that group. And I move the group, but relative to the group, the control is still in the same place, which is what we want. Then this is where you can put some extra fanciness, and we'll get into it later. Just trust me that it's a useful thing to have in place. So always double group your control so that you can have more functionality later. Once you have this in place, you can actually duplicate, hold V, snap it on top of that, duplicate, hold V, snap it on top of that. Holding V, and then when you move from the middle, it'll snap to joints like that.
So you need a circle for each joint.
Yeah, so this is the way FK controls work, is you just want to be able to rotate anywhere there's a joint. So on the leg, there's a hip, knee, ankle, and toe. So now that I have all of these, because I was just duplicating, I should be able to use my search and replace again. This one is my knee. Come up here to modify, search and replace. Look for hip, replace with knee. Wham. Get rid of the one. search for hip, replace with ankle. Replace with, I guess, foot. Great. So let's say I'm not happy with the size of each of the controls. Maybe the hip is okay, but this knee is like really big and it kind of goes over into the other knee. You can adjust the shape of a curve without necessarily scaling it or rotating it, because that will actually adjust these things over here. The way to do that is you just right click on your curve and say control vertex. Then, so that I don't want to select joints, so I'll turn that off. I can highlight these and adjust the size. I could even put it like way over here. This is an example. When I select it, the pivot point is still here, because all I'm doing is adjusting like where you see the curve. I'm not adjusting where the curve is located. So I'll leave it here, kind of a little more tightly nested around my knee. I'll repeat that for ankle. And toe. And the toe I'll actually shift around a little bit. And you can grab just one point at a time if you want. Really customize the shape so that you get maybe a little bit of a visual cue on which control you're messing with. Great. Now I've got, oh, get this one, it's a little big. I've got my 4 controls around my 4 control joints, but currently my control joints, if I do something, the controls don't affect them. So we got to repeat the process that we did with our control joints to our deformer joint. We got to do that now with our control to our control joint. So if I select my hip first, and then holding shift, select my control second, come up to constraint and go parent. Oh, I did it wrong. See, easy to forget, and you'll see it pop around if you've done it in the wrong order. So I want my joint to follow. So I do my control first, joint second, parent. And see how it pops like that? The reason is because it's like reorienting itself to the control. To avoid that, you can come up to maintain offset. Select your control first, joint second, and hit apply. And then it stays put because it will allow the offset. So now if I rotate that, works. Repeat that process with the knee, ankle, and another hotkey that's super useful, I use it all the time, it's G. G is whatever you just did. So if you had just done a parent constraint, you can just tap G. If you had just done duplicate, then you could hit G and it would duplicate. So because the last thing I did was parent constraint, I can just select my control joint and hit G, and it will add the parent constraint. Cool. So now each of these joints is following along, but you see when I rotate the knee, it is affecting it, but it's not actually making the controls behave correctly. The reason is because now we have to set the controls up to actually behave how we would want. To make that happen, we want to do direct parenting at this point. So the knee, we want to be a direct child of the hip. But we would need to make sure that we're doing the parenting of our group to the right thing, because that is actually the thing that needs to follow along. So the order that I would recommend here is select your group first, hold command, click your control second, and hit P. And that'll put the knee underneath of your hip control. Repeat that with the ankle. And then repeat it with the foot. Great, so now you can see this is all one single chain. This is what a FK control chain should look like. They're directly parented to each other so that if I were to rotate, yep, everything follows along. If I were to rotate the knee, everything follows along. If I were to rotate the ankle and the toe. All right, cool. We have our first control joints set up. We have our first controls set up. And both of those are talking to, well, the controls are talking to the control joints, and the control joints are talking to the deformers. So in the end, what you get is the ability to put keyframe animation on this control. And you're good to go. Cool. So hang in there for just a little bit longer and you'll see why we had to go through that, because I'm going to put the IK chain on the leg now. So leaving my parent constraint options up, I'll select my FK chain, duplicate it. But this time I'm going to modify, search and replace, look for FK, replace with IK. And because this is a duplicate, it also brought along the parent constraints. I'll just clear those out because that's not what I want. I don't want them following along with the FK controls. This is a new joint chain, so I'll hide my FK joints, and I'll also hide my controls so they don't distract me from what I'm trying to do. All right, so this control chain is going to use IK, and the type of IK that we're going to use is just an IK handle. There are two types. There's IK handle and an IK spline. Splines are really good for like spines, and like if you're rigging a fish or a snake or something like that. That's what I would use that for. For a limb, I think the IK handle is much better because it gives you just one single control point in the end, and you can drag it around and your knee behaves correctly. You just need those 3 points. So I'll select IK handle, click the top joint first, ankle joint second, and you'll get this. So this arrow is indicating what direction the knee is going to go when you bend. And because we spent so much time trying to get our limbs all lined up nicely, this is exactly what we want. When I bend this leg, it folds up like that, folds up forward. If you didn't spend a bunch of time making these joints all nicely aligned, then this arrow might be pointing off to the side or backwards, so that when you fold your leg, the knee's like, and it goes a weird direction. That's why you got to pay attention to your joint orientation for your limbs, because it'll make this process really frustrating if it's not set up right. You can always go back and fix it so that it's good, but that's why I spent a lot of time explaining it in previous classes. Cool. So this is an IK handle. If they're in the way later, you can turn those off, at least their visibility. Just checking it here. Or if you don't see it, then somehow this might have gotten turned off. So we can turn it back on. Great. Setting up this control scheme is a little bit, no, it's I think maybe just as complicated as the FK. But I'll do the same process of making a circle, scaling it down This one I'm going to have be like around the foot and look like it's on the ground. So I'll actually maybe shape it a little bit like a foot. Like that. All right, so this is my foot control. I'll freeze transformation so that I'm starting from a nice neutral beginning point. Rename it our foot like a control. Oops. Boom. Once again, highly recommend double group. And how I did that, again, hold control and hit G with your object selected. Because this object is in the middle of the world, everything works out great because groups by default are made at the middle of the world. If I had moved this off to the side like that and then done a group, then these won't be in the same place because it makes the group in the middle and this thing's over here. That's not what I want. So when you're grouping, make sure that you're right in the middle of the world to begin with, okay?
If you make your circle and it doesn't end up in the middle of the world, how would you fix that to ensure that you are acceptable?
So if I had made my circle and for whatever reason gone like that,
Yeah.
to get it back to the middle of the world, so this is your pivot point. Anytime you hit W, it should show you exactly where the pivot point is. If you hold X, then you can snap to the grid. So when I move from the middle, you can snap it to different points here. So I would just snap it back in the middle. And then once it's there, you want to make sure that this is all zeroed out. So you would go modify freeze transformation, and then that will clear everything out.
Are you able to hide like things coming down?
What's that?
Are you able to hide like boxes coming down?
Like that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right, so let's get this thing looking like a foot again. That's a terrible sound. All right. Modify freeze transformation. Or foot like a control group. C group. And group. Cool. So this one. I'll shift so that it's in place. And the one trick that I like to do with these controls, so that what I want to happen with this control is when I rotate it, it actually rotates here at the ankle. You can change the pivot point of any object using modify pivot point. The hotkey for that is D. See how it changes the cursor to look like this? So that means when I move this, that's actually where this thing's new reference point is. So how you can combine this with previous hotkeys is you hold D and V together as in void. Now if I click, it'll snap to the joint. So I've modified the pivot point to be right on top of the ankle. And none of this has changed over here. So it's still at 0, 0, 0 and rotated 0. But when I go like that now, it'll make the control scheme a little bit easier. Okay. D as in dice, and D as in dog, and V as in very or void. Okay. So I've got my foot control, the next one that I need is a knee control. So the way that this thing works is, so if I've moved my control handle, I can still control where the knee goes by using different parameters on this thing. But really what we're going to use is a special type of constraint called a pole vector. But we need to have the knee set up in the exact right place. So this is, I think, where the hardest part of the control scheme comes in. I'll make a new circle. And I actually like to make these type of controls maybe a little bit like a crosshair. So I'll grab those and I'll scale them in. And I'll also, handle, there we go. Let's scale this down too. All right, so this is going to be my knee control. I'll rotate it so that it's flat, 90 degrees. Freeze transformations, it's pointing directly forward. Our knee high kick. Get me again. C group and group. So this one, I want to snap it directly on top of the knee, but also make sure that I'm pointing in the correct direction that the hip is. This is where the difficult part of this comes into play. So holding V, I'll snap. And then what you want to make sure is that the orientation of your hip and where this thing is pointing is exactly the same. The quickest way to make that happen would be to do a parent constraint and zero it out. But as long as you've been, I guess, setting things up, how this is, you should just be able to drag it in this one direction, like that, because this is pointing directly at that. Now that this is a little bit out in front of the knee, what you can do is add a pole vector constraint to our handle. So with the control selected first, holding shift, select your handle second, constrain, and then pole vector. Now you can see it has this little line. What this means is that that will follow and aim itself at that knee control. So those two things combined are how you would kind of adjust the leg and get it working correctly. The final little thing you need to add is one last constraint to the foot control, because if you'll notice, when I rotate the knee, it rotates the whole thing. I don't want my foot to also pivot. I want my foot to stay put. So to make that happen, you select your control first, your ankle joint second, and you'll use just an orient constraint. So instead of doing all of the or like both the translate and rotate, an orient will only do rotates. So you can see it only has this little blue indicator on the rotates for this joint. So if I were to shift this around now, see the foot is staying still. This is pretty much, almost there. So if I were to move that, almost there. The final constraint is this handle. So I want the handle to follow along with the control. So I'll select my control first, hold shift, select my handle second. And this time, instead of parent, I'll do a point because I only want to follow the position. I'll bring up the options for that. Offset. I hit apply. So this thing now has the blue indicators on the translate, which means that if I were to move my control, the handle follows along, but I can also rotate this control and the foot follows along. I'll pause there. This is definitely trickier because it's not really how I guess things behave naturally. The FK to me seems more straightforward because it's just like how you would position a mannequin or whatever. If you're drawing a character, just rotate the joints and that's how it works. This FK, because it works inverse, it works reverse, is a little bit trickier. So this control affects the IK handle. It also rotates this ankle joint. This control is set up so that it points the knee in a specific direction. So if I were to want my legs to bow out as I collapsed, or maybe bow in as they collapse, you can animate this separately and start to get stuff. Cool. So clean up. I'll go ahead and grab my IK handle and hide it because I don't want to always be seeing that. I'll go ahead and now constrain my deformer joints, specifically my right leg, to this new joint set. So hip first, control first, hip second, constrain, the options, apply. Control joint first, deformer second. And I'm hitting G to repeat my last operation. So great. Now, if I were to show my joints, what you'll see at this point is things almost working right. So if I move this control, see how it starts to not quite be in the right place. The reason is because now, if I select my deformer joint, you can see over here in the channel box, I've got this constraint listed, and both the FK joint and the IK joint have a weight of 1, meaning they're both 100% influencing the joint. So what does that add up to? Well, they're both at 100, so that's about 50-50, right? Each joint is influencing 50%. So if I didn't want one of my joints to influence, my control joints to influence, I can actually set that to 0. And if I go down my deformer chain and set all my FK weights 0, the behavior that I'll expect is that my IK joints will be 100% in control. So it's following along totally. Right? Pause there. Does that make sense? I have 2 duplicate joint chains. The original deformer joint chain is parented to both of them. But you can turn off and on, or you can say how much influence each joint chain has as a way of getting different control styles. Right now, it's set up to be 100% IK. So it's 100% influenced by IK. So if I were animating now, I'd be animating using IK controls. If I wanted the opposite, I would flip it over to be FK. And that way it would be 100% FK influenced and the IK would not be animating at all. So the next step is how to do that quickly and easily with a single control. All right. And okay, so I've got a chat message. Can you show the constraint used for the pole targeting? Sure. That one is, Get out of here. It is the pole vector constraint. And to get the pole vector to work, you would still have your IK handle visible. You would select the knee control first, hold shift, select the IK handle second, and then do constrain pole vector. Good. Going once, going twice. Okay, we'll move on. Yep, no problem. So I've been doing a pretty good job as I've been going along, naming things so that I know what is what. Right now, this IK handle is just called IK handle 1. And by the end, you probably will have 4 IK handles, 1 for each leg. So you want to make sure to name this thing as well. I'll just say right leg.
Is there any method that we can use to like, kind of check that we set it up correctly before continuing?
How do you mean, like?
So like, I mean, so I'm setting up the man in the control changes, but is there a way for me to check it to make sure that I've set everything up correctly before like it's supposed to move a certain way? I should watch out for.
Sure, yeah. So what I would expect when I use the IK controls is that if I move the foot using the move tool, it follows directly along with it. If I rotate the foot control, it rotates from the ankle, right? And if I move the knee control, your knee should always try and point at it. So that would be the behavior that I would expect with the IK controls. I think I can do this all at once. If I wanted my FK controls, yeah, so this is, I guess I did, it only flipped the first one. Okay. Okay. And then the FK controls, the behavior that I would expect is anything that is below should follow. So if I move the hip, everything goes. If I move the knee, everything below that goes, but the hip stays in place. If I rotate the ankle, the knee stays in place, but the toe goes. So that's the behavior I'd expect for an FK control. I have seen people use translates on FK. I don't really think that's what it's for. I suppose you could do it. So in general, when you're animating an FK, you're just animating the rotates, just like rotating them around. Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, I see. So the important angle to pay attention to, or the important formation to set up with the leg. So this is specifically for the leg. So right now I'm in the side view. So when you lay out your joints, I would recommend using the side view for the leg. The reason being, if I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So there's a leg, right? Because I'm in the side view, it projected it right in the middle of the world. So if I flip back to perspective, you can see these joints are perfectly in the middle. They're all at 0, 0, 0. And so if I were to put an IK on this, it would work perfectly because of how it got laid out. Boom. So it's pointing right down the middle. You could shift this a little bit, like, so if I did like that and like that, as long as I only adjust the hips rotation, when I drop an IK on here, it's going to be pointing right in line with the knee because I didn't adjust anything else. So let's see what happens. So if I had laid them out individually and stuff was like this, a little bit off. The reason that you would know it's off is because if I look at the knee, you can see it has information here in more than just the one channel, because it should be pointing directly at the next joint. So what will happen in this case, let's select IK, click the top, click the bottom. And what I would want is for the knee to just bend straight out, but because of how things are set up, it is going off to the side and it's not behaving at all, which is very, very frustrating. I guess whatever method you feel comfortable with, knowing that it's going to be lined up straight, that's the method I would go with. If that doesn't mean you have to delete everything, then great. If it does mean you have to delete everything, then that's what I would go with. Okay. All right. So now that I have everything nice and organized, I'm going to start to create a couple more buckets that I can drop things into as I'm going along. So like I said previously, rigs get complicated. You can see it's already starting to add a bunch over here in my outliner. So what I'll do is actually just make a couple of empty groups by saying create empty group and create empty group. And they're just in the middle of the world, and that's fine. You don't have to do anything. This is strictly so that you can just put stuff into buckets. This first one I'm going to call control joints. And this is where I'll put all my duplicate joint chains. So I'll grab my FK joints and my IK joints, and then holding command, on a Mac or control on PC, select that last and hit P. So that dropped my control joints in here. That's great. Then this group I'll just call controls. Oops. And I usually put everything that isn't a joint in here. So there are a bunch of different types of stuff. IK handles, sometimes you use clusters, you use other things. I just use this as a catch-all for that stuff. So I'll grab my controls all the way up to here. So my IK controls and my FK controls and my handle. And then I'll hold command, select that. Now I've got a little bit more organization. It's looking good. You can also turn off stuff, turn off the visibility of things so that it's not too much to keep track of. Okay, right now all my controls are looking, they have a little bit of unique shape language. This is, I guess the next little part is a little bit personal preference. When you're first going through, you don't have to do this. This is just an option that I want to point out now, in case it will help you keep track of things and know what is turned on and what is not turned on. You can change the color of these control splines by like that and like that. Selecting any of them, coming over here to the attribute editor. If you don't see your attribute editor, it should be this button. Yep, that button. And then you have a couple tabs, and this is all the information associated with this. The one that we want to use is the IK control shape. Come over here to object display. drawing overrides, enable override. And then if you change this little slider down here, you can actually change the color. I've gotten in the habit of making all my IK controls red, like that. And then I usually make my FK controls yellow, but you can use whichever one you want. I like bold colors so they're easy to see what's going on. This will also, I think, help know what's going on for the next step of the process, which is using something called a set-driven key to affect multiple other objects. So what does that mean? If I were to make a new little control out here, and what I'm going to do is add a new attribute to this control by going edit, add attribute. Currently there's translate, rotate, and whatever. I'll call this IK, FK, switch. And I will make it a Boolean, which is basic. No, that's wrong. I want to make it an enum. So an enum is basically, you can give it a label, like so you can pick from between different labels. The default labels that it gives you are green and blue. I don't want that. I'll click on the green and I'll change this to FK. And I'll click on the blue and change it to IK. Once I've done that, I can hit add. So now I've got this thing called IK-FK switch. And the two options that it can be are either FK or IK. Does that make sense? That I added an entry? Yep. Sure. Okay. All right. So if you can attach, you can add an attribute to anything. I chose to make a new control by clicking the circle. With the circle selected, I went to add attribute. And the attribute that I chose is an enum. The name that I'm giving it is IK-FK switch. And then I'm changing the two default things that it could be. Instead of green, I make it FK. And instead of blue, I make it IK. So now I should have those two available on my circuit. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link up the visibility of the controls, so whether you can see them or not, and what parent constraint is active, all to that one little flip. So if I switch it to FK, it will turn off the IK controls, and it will also turn off all the parent constraints for the IK joints. And then alternatively, if I switch it to IK, it will do the reverse. It will turn off all the FK controls and all the FK parent constraints. Right. The way that you get a set-driven key is select the thing, click the attribute that you want to be the driver, go to edit, set-driven key. And we'll bring up this menu here. Then what you want is for this circle control to be up here in the driver section. So you would, with it selected, hit load driver. That'll put it up here. And then the attribute that you want to be the one that when you press this button down here, key, you want to make sure that that's selected, okay? So the first thing that we'll get set up is just turning off and on the visibility of the controls. So I will select my IK first. You can select them at the same time. So I selected this one, held shift, selected that, and said load driven. They both appear over here. If you select both of these, what will show up in this column is anything that's common. So because both of these controls have scales, rotates, translates, and visibility, each one of those attributes shows up over here. The thing that I'm going to be keyframing is visibility. So I'll select that. All right, so now my set driven key window is set up correctly. And I'm not going to adjust anything over here until I make sure that all of this is set up in the way that I want it. So right now the switch is not in the right way. So what I would want is for it to be on IK. These things are turned on currently. So if I hit key, what I just said is when this thing is set to IK, the visibility on these should be on. Now that I've done that, what I can do is switch this to FK. So first you adjust your attribute, then you adjust the things that the attribute will be changing. So with both of these selected, I'll come over here to visibility, say off. I've got my IK switch active here. Both of these are selected, visibility and key. So what I would expect is when I hit IK, it turns on. And when I hit FK, it turns off. And so you can keep adding to this now. So with my new selection, which is going to be all of my FK controls, I'll hit load driven. Now it plops them all down here. I'll select all of them. Hit visibility. Look at my control. It's currently set to FK. So in this case, I would expect my FK controls to be visible. So everything looks like it's good. So I'll hit key. Then I'll select my control first, adjust the driver over to IK. Grab all my controls. And in this case, I would expect all of these to be on. Hit key one more time. So now I can flip the visibility of my controls back and forth. Pause there. Does that make sense? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Going through it once will help, but I guess is it kind of making sense at this point. All right. Now the next step is to make sure that the constraints are also being driven by this attribute. So how do I get that going? Well, I'm going to go over to my handy dandy control joints. Oh, no, not my handy dandy control joints. I'm going to go over to the deformer joints and select all of my constraints that are currently on this leg. And then hit load driven. So each one of these, the thing that I'm going to be driving isn't the same for each other. So I'm not able to do it all at once. I need to do them one at a time, which is a little annoying, but you should only have to do it once. So if I select this, now you can see that I've got a hip FK joint weight and a hip IK joint weight. This has a knee, this has ankle. So I'm currently set to FK. So with the hip, I would select both of these. The FK joint and the hip IK joint. Find my constraint over here in the outliner and make sure that the weights are set up correctly. It is, because it looks like my FK is driving 100% and the FK is driving 100% and the IK is 0%. So I should be good to key that. Similarly, the knee is also good. And the foot. So then we just need to do the reverse after we go to the IK. Starting from the top, 0 and 1. Select the key. Zero, one, oops. 0, 1, key. And last one. Okay, cool. So let's see how we did. What I expect to happen at this point. Because my control is on IK, my IK controls are visible. Also, if I move my control, it's moving with IK controls. If I were to flip this to FK, my FK controls are visible and my FK controls are in control. Yay, that's the first IK FK joint chain we got set up. So the next step, repeat it 3 more times and make sure that it's named all correctly. So, and that's the name of the game. This is definitely a tricky part of the process. And the first time you go through, you'll probably run into IK joints not bending right and maybe things not being parented correctly for the FK. So don't worry if you don't get it the first time, just keep going. And I'm going to go around and kind of check in and see what wasn't making sense, what was making sense. And in case people on the Zoom, where are we at with our Zoom? In case people on the Zoom log out early, what I would hope for Monday is that you at least have one of your limbs set up with an IK chain and an FK chain, and that those chains are driving your deformer joints, and that you have your set driven keys flipping. Stretch goal, that you have all 4 done. The body won't move right because we still haven't done the spine and like linking it all together. That'll be the next demo. But if you're able to kind of wiggle the arms around and wiggle the legs around correctly based on the control, that would be super awesome.
So that's what you mean by the other 3 that need to be done, both the legs and arms.
Yeah, so at this point, you would still need to do left leg and right arm and right arm and left leg. Yep.
Okay, when we do the second leg or I guess the second arm, are you going to also place it in those groups as well?
Yeah, you would set up your controls the same always. You should kind of start from that neutral, double group it, move it into place using the high level group, that top level group. And
We're gonna
then
have a lot of stuff in our
by the end, there's going to be a ton of stuff. That's why getting these 2 buckets in place is going to be really helpful. Yep.
More like a last question. Is there any data on like a node demo period?
And then just the work day.
Yeah, because I think I got to listen to the lecture, but I think it's when I want to ask questions about this and not the that.
Okay. Yes. I hope so. The problem is there's just so much material to cover, and yeah, I want to get you guys at least like the first time through it, so that you at least know the things. Whether or not it's working correctly is different, but yeah, I expect that. So what's today, Wednesday? Yeah, I expect that probably next Wednesday will be more of a work day. Next Monday, there'll still be, I think, a good demo because we'll want to try and connect all the stuff together. And also maybe do a little bit of an animation demo. So on Monday, I'll have a character that everybody can use if you want to use that character. So you could start trying to keep your animation with how this should be set up by the end. Does that make sense? Okay. And once again, today I will check in with Zoom first.